Welcome back to another edition of You Gonna Learn Today. In honor of Juneteenth, I've been thinking a lot about slavery and the disturbing way in which it is taught in a number of schools. Many children are still exposed to these narratives that slaves were simple, uncomplicated people who were content to be in slavery. But imagine what that kind of narrative does to the psyche of a child. It engenders a sense of shame and embarrassment, not pride. But there's no moral depravity in being a slave. One of the things I'm concerned about is that when we teach slavery the way it is often taught, we do not focus on slaves as engaging in psychological resistance mechanisms. The slaves fought back. They were not passive people. They worked to destroy a slave economy by running away, by breaking equipment, by pretending to be sick, by poisoning food, by theft. In extreme cases, they would engage in self-mutilation and suicide. But this is a very different narrative than one that says slaves were content with servitude. So I want to share with you a couple of books that sort of speak to me on Juneteenth. The first one is Ivan Van Sertima's classic, They Came Before Columbus. In this book, he provides historical documentation that Africans came to the Americas 300 years prior to the arrival of Christopher Columbus. The second book, Medicalizing Blackness, is by Raina Hogarth, and it's a powerful book, and it talks about doctors during the antebellum slave period. At that point, doctors did not have strong reputations. And because they didn't, they would go around a plantation saying that they were experts in slave medicine. And as a result of being experts in slave medicine, they came up with these fabricated diseases. So one was drapetomania, and that's runaway slave disease. Another was cachexia africana, and that's dirt-eating disease. One of the things I really liked about the book is that it challenged the myth that slaves were immune to yellow fever. I know I learned as a child that slaves could withstand yellow fever because they came from tropical climates. But in this book, she talks about the notion that slaves had the same mortality rates as whites and Native Americans around yellow fever. So basically what that says is that if you're a slave, you can tell the slave, go back out and get a couple more bales of cotton. You're not sick. For me, that has echoes of COVID. The next book that I want to talk about is White Trash by Nancy Eisenberg, The 400-Year Untold History of Class in America. And in this book, the major takeaway for me was that the English wanted to get rid of the growing population of poor and indigent people there, so they sent them to the Americas, never expecting them to be able to survive the conditions and needing to clear the land and sort of eke out an existence for them. They were seen as lazy and shiftless, and they were called scallywags and rubbish and hillbillies. And they were held in contempt. And so for me, the book created an understanding of the deep-seated resentment that some whites have towards African Americans. The last book that I want to talk about is Carol Anderson's White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. And in this book, she talks about what whites are so angry about. And she says that white rage is fueled by Black progress. And in it, she talks about all of the efforts that whites have gone to hold Blacks back. She talks about the Black codes, which were instituted following slavery. She talks about lynching, which for me has echoes of George Floyd. She talked about the convict leasing programs where following slavery, Blacks were incarcerated for very small infractions, and then they were leased back out to former slaveholders for pennies on a dollar. She talked about the sterilization of African American women, more recently voter suppression. So I encourage people to read some of these books and look at parallels between what happened historically and what is happening now. Thank you again for joining another episode of You Gonna Learn Today.